On the lower Potomac River in early April 1959, there's a small motorboat dredging for oysters in the shallows on the Maryland side of the channel. The work is illegal. It's done at night to avoid detection. Two state patrol boats surge out of the darkness, closing fast. A chase breaks towards the Virginia shoreline. The patrol boats fire dozens of shots during pursuit. One man on the fleeing vessel gets hit. The boat runs aground on a quiet stretch of shore, and by the time the engines fall silent, the consequences are irreversible. To understand how a disagreement over shellfish escalated into nearly a century of armed conflict, one must first understand the Chesapeake Bay as it was before the wars. In the 19th century, the Chesapeake was an oyster paradise, its brackish water creating the ideal conditions for immense dense reefs of the eastern oyster. It was an ecosystem of almost unimaginable abundance. In the early 19th century, oyster reefs, or rocks, grew so thick that ships were forced to navigate around them. At the industry's peak in the 1880s, the bay yielded a staggering 10 to 15 million bushels of oysters annually. This single body of water supplied nearly half of the world's oysters. Oysters became known as white gold, a commodity that fueled a regional boom. Baltimore became the epicenter of the industry, with more than 60 canneries lining its harbor, shipping Chesapeake oysters to California and even overseas to Europe. Towns like Crisfield, Maryland sprang up around the packing houses. Harvesting oysters was done by two competing methods: traditional hand tongs used by small-scale watermen in shallow waters, and the industrial oyster dredge, a large iron-toothed scraper dragged by sailing schooners. In the years after the Civil War, this seemingly limitless resource would be placed under pressures it could not sustain. Three forces converged on the bay after 1865. The first was economic. Post-war industrialization, powered by the expansion of railroads and new canning technology, transformed the oyster from a local foodstuff into a lucrative global commodity. The second pressure was technological. Hand tongs were laborious and limited to shallow water, a sustainable but inefficient method. By contrast, the oyster dredge was brutally efficient. The final pressure was jurisdictional. Maryland and Virginia, the two states governing the bay, took divergent legal approaches. As early as 1820, Maryland banned dredging to protect its reefs and the livelihood of its numerous hand-tongers. Virginia, however, allowed licensed dredging in certain areas. Virginia also encouraged private oyster planting and the leasing of riverbeds, viewing the oyster not as a public commons to be protected, but as a private commodity to be farmed and exploited. This fundamental legal mismatch created a powder keg. Virginia's dredge boats frequently crossed into Maryland's protected waters. Early attempts at regulation only inflamed the situation. In 1865, Maryland's General License Act sought to manage the harvest by selling permits. The law backfired. Over 1,300 licenses were issued in the first season alone, encouraging what became a dredging free-for-all. With the resource defined, the pressures established, and early attempts at control failing, the conflict was now driven by decisions of key individuals. In 1868, the Maryland legislature appropriated $22,000 to create the State Oyster Police Force, soon nicknamed the Oyster Navy. Its first commander was Hunter Davidson, a former Confederate naval officer tasked with imposing order on the chaotic waters. Davidson armed his flagship, the Layla, with a 12-pounder cannon. He faced constant danger, surviving an assassination plot in 1871 orchestrated by the notorious pirate captain Gus Rice. Constrained by a vast patrol area and political interference, Davidson eventually resigned, but he established the state's commitment to enforcement. In Virginia, the response was more personal. Between 1882 and 1883, Governor William E. Cameron took the extraordinary step of personally leading armed raids against illegal dredgers. His efforts were largely unsuccessful in the long term, as pirates simply escaped across the Maryland line. Opposing these state actors were the oyster pirates themselves, driven by profit. They were not a monolith, but organized groups of illegal dredgers who saw the bay's riches as theirs for the taking. The Cannon family of Maryland's eastern shore, led by Sylvester Cannon and his father H.P. Cannon, known as the Pirate King, became infamous for their organized, violent defiance. They threatened judges, fired upon police vessels, and engaged in open battles, embodying the lawlessness that had taken root on the bay. Locked in opposition, these actors and their conflicting incentives ensured that the building pressure would soon fracture into open violence. In the 1870s and 1880s, authority on the water began to break down, and violence became a normalized tool of commerce. By the late 1870s, pressure on the Chesapeake had begun to convert into direct confrontation. In the winter of 1879, along Virginia's Rappahannock River, approximately 40 Maryland dredging boats began harvesting oysters illegally. Local tongers attempted to force the dredgers out of the grounds. The dredgers responded by opening fire on the tonging boats. After complaints reached state officials, Virginia supplied the tongers with artillery, rifles, and ammunition to defend the river. In 1884, after a judge issued warrants for his arrest, pirate captain Sylvester Cannon's crew retaliated by firing bullets into the judge's waterfront home. These fractures in authority, both between and within the states, set the stage for the conflict's deadliest confrontations. The winter of 1888 to 1889 marked the bloodiest period of the Oyster Wars. In December 1888, the Maryland Oyster Oyster Navy led by Commander Thomas Howard launched a major offensive. Pirate boss Gus Rice had anchored a defensive flotilla of 12 dredge boats, lashed together in a circle. Howard's flagship, the steam gunboat Governor R.M. McLean, rammed the pirate raft and opened fire with its cannon at point-blank range. 2 pirate boats were sunk. The engagement asserted state authority at significant cost. The pirates retaliated a month later. In January 1889, a group of dredgers ambushed and captured the Maryland police schooner E.B. Groom. In an act of ultimate humiliation, the captured officers were forced to work the dredgers at gunpoint before being released. By the spring of 1889, more than a dozen men had been killed in the fighting that winter. Newspapers in the Chesapeake were running headlines about a bloody fight with oyster pirates, signaling a decisive shift in public perception. The decades of conflict left behind a wake of devastation for the ecosystem, the economy, and the culture of the Chesapeake Bay. By the time the war subsided, the ecological damage was catastrophic. The bay's oyster population had collapsed to less than 1% of its historic levels. This had a profound ripple effect. Oysters are filter feeders, where the historic population could filter the entire volume of the Chesapeake Bay in a matter of days. The depleted population now takes over a year to perform the same task. The economic collapse mirrored the ecological one. The boom was undeniably over. By the 1960s, the combined annual oyster harvest of Maryland and Virginia was less than 5% of its 1880s peak. For the watermen, the end of the oyster rush meant the end of a way of life. The rough, Wild West days on the water were replaced by quieter, more regulated times. 2 forces brought the era of open warfare to a close. The first was ecological reality. The conflict de-escalated in part because the oyster stocks that it fueled were collapsing. Overharvesting combined later with parasitic diseases such as MSX and dermo and increased pollution meant that there was increasingly little left to fight over. The second force was institutional. The Maryland Oyster Police Force, born in the chaos of 1868, slowly professionalized, evolving into one of the nation's oldest conservation law enforcement agencies, the modern Maryland Natural Resources Police. Virginia's forces underwent a similar maturation. Order returned to the bay, but only after the resource that fueled a vibrant economy and a century of chaos was nearly gone. By the mid-20th century, the large pirate fleets were gone, but illegal dredging persisted in smaller, faster boats, operating at night along contested waterways. Enforcement had become more professionalized, more centralized, and more heavily armed. The jurisdictional boundary between Maryland and Virginia, once a source of open warfare, still structured every encounter. In April of 1959, during one such enforcement action on the lower Potomac River, a man was shot by Maryland officers while dredging illegally. His name was Berkeley Muse. He was 31 years old and married with 3 children. His death did not resemble the battles of the 1880s. Instead, it shined a spotlight on what the conflict had become: smaller, quieter, but no less deadly. The shooting forced Maryland and Virginia to confront a reality long deferred, that unilateral enforcement on a shared river could no longer be sustained. Just 9 days after Muse's death, the 2 states entered into a long-delayed pact for joint enforcement of the Bay's oyster legislation. Within years, the Potomac River Fisheries Commission was fully empowered, establishing joint rules and coordinated patrols where rivalry had once prevailed. The system stabilized, the violence subsided, but it did so only after the resource that fueled the conflict had largely disappeared. Decades after the last shot was fired, the Chesapeake continues to bear the scars of its long war. Despite the end of the conflict, and despite years of dedicated restoration efforts, the Bay's oyster population remains a small fraction of its historical abundance. Even though the violence ended, the water could not restore what was taken from it. We tend to think of history as a series of isolated events, but the real story lives in the collision. To see another moment where the course of events shifted before anyone understood why, click right here.